So I am from The Ohio State University, and if you happen to have been paying attention to this, which I'm not sure, we tried to trademark the word "the" recently in the States, and you'd be surprised that how much we got made fun of for this, and that we were actually unsuccessful. Trademark said that the word "the" is too general, and you can't trademark it. But that's what we wanted to do. We love the word "the." We're always at The Ohio State University, and we're very particular about that. So I want to talk to you a little bit about our trip in our from where we were about 10 years ago to where we are today with our use of BIM as an organization. And I'm primarily going to be talking about how we've gone on the facilities management side or the space management side from a 2D world into this 3D world of Revit and BIM. And so to start off, I'll talk about the Buckeye BIM initiative kind of as a whole. And that's three different parts. First is, as I mentioned, the BIM for existing buildings, what we've been doing in transitioning our existing facilities into Revit. I'll talk briefly about BIM for design and construction and kind of how that all connects together to what we've been doing, and then even more briefly about BIM for operations. And so we think about this in a continuum of build, maintain, and integrate. So we're building all these models of our facilities. We're then maintaining those models over time as changes occur. And then we're integrating all of this great data we get from projects into our existing models. So when we first started off this whole project a number of years ago, we had this project objective that we put out there. And it was to enhance planning and communication, resulting in improved quality and speed of decision making. So said more briefly, concisely, we wanted to help the organization make better decisions more quickly. And we want to be the repository of all sorts of facilities data, and we do that through tying everything back into our floor plans and the data that we have in our building models. And so we've always tried to think about all of our different use cases that we apply BIM to through this idea of improved quality and speed of decision making. Can it help us make can it help the organization make better decisions more quickly? And I'm going to show you lots of use cases, lots of ways we've done this that have helped us in that way. So from a timeline perspective, I always like to help people understand that making this kind of transition is not an overnight success. It's not something that happens quickly. We started thinking about and researching in 2008, 2009 what BIM might mean for us as an owner. Started having some conversations with a consultant in town that really kind of adopted us a little bit, and just started having conversations with us about what BIM was doing for them in their organization and what it might mean for an owner, and really trying to understand from us too what our gaps are, what we're trying to accomplish. In 2010, we hired a student and we said, look, we don't really know a lot about this Revit thing, but if you just go build us a model this summer and tell us what you learned, that would be great. And track your time too, because we want to have an idea how long it would take to actually do this. We had a great student, we hired the right one, gave him no instructions, and he came back and had a model that we were able to then take to senior leaders and say, hey, if we applied some better processes, some more standardization to this is kind of some of the outcomes you might be able to get. Here's an existing building of ours, and here's what it might look like if we had it. And here's some things we can do with these models. And we were able to get some funding specifically in our medical center to begin the process of transitioning specifically just the medical center buildings, which was around 6 million square feet, and transitioning that into Revit. Moving forward from there, then we eventually developed a building design standard, a building project, or BIM project delivery standard. So we required all of I'll talk a little more about that later, on how we require projects to be done in Revit and delivered that way. And then for the last number of years, we've been then transitioning that project over to the remainder of campus, which is around 36 million square feet. So BIM for existing buildings, and I apologize. I realize now I probably should have changed this into meters, but I can't do that in my head. So we're about 89.2% complete with our campus, which is, around, we have about 365 buildings currently in Revit, which is a little under 33 million square feet. It should take us about 2 more years or so to finish the remainder of our campus, which will give us around 550 buildings that will actually be in 3 dimensions. One of the first things that we had to think about when we first started looking at making this change was, what do we want to have in this model? And when you're thinking about a construction project, you're going to have a design intent model or a work intent or even an as-built. We like to think of this as our as-maintained model, and we call it our owner's model. And we had to ask a lot of questions around what do we want in that model, what do we not want in that model. We asked our customers a lot of those questions too. What's useful to you? If we're going to make this switch from AutoCAD to Revit, we have an opportunity to think about what we want to put in there. We had a certain number of things that were in our AutoCADs, but we have a chance now to think about what we want to have in our Revit models. Now, if you ask enough customers, enough people who use our information, about what they want in that Revit model, you're basically going to rebuild the entire building down to every nut and screw, right? I mean, everybody wants something. So you have to think about what is the most valuable things, and we had to think about that whole return on investment. If we're going to build it, does it have the most use for most people? But also, I only have so much staff on my team, and so what can we actually maintain? We can't say we're going to build all this stuff at the beginning of the project and then just really not have the staff to maintain that level of detail going forward. So we had to kind of think through those things too. The big question, especially at first, was what supports our planning efforts? What supports all those planning use cases? We were then, and we still now are, really under the planning side of our organization, not so much our operations, although we do significantly more work with them now. And so what's going to help us plan our facilities for the future and in the current time? And so what that meant is we came up with this owner's model. And it basically, we have pretty detailed walls, windows, doors, but we have more basic roofs and more basic stairs. We have some casework and in some areas and not in others. But this was the list that for us made a lot of sense and was the most valuable things that we could add to our models. So we made this decision at the time in the medical center to transition to Revit for our facilities. And we brought in a consultant to help us think through, well, how would we want to go about this? We don't want to just start creating Revit models and just kind of winging it. We wanted to start thinking carefully about how we want to build those models and what's the right process for that. And we knew we wanted to do this process primarily with students, letting students do the bulk of the labor. So we knew we needed to have some really good ways of documenting that process so it's consistent with our students. We wanted to have ways to make sure we could train our students, and we also wanted to make sure we could check their work too, so we had to kind of think through these things. So the first thing was just developing a lot of standards around what the Revit model is going to look like. What is the project browser going to look like? What kind of views are we going to have? What kind of sheets are we going to have? What kind of schedules are we going to have? And we had a great consultant that really helped us think through, what do you need? What makes sense? What does your AutoCAD look like today? What do you want to change it to in the future? And taking all those things into consideration, they're able to help us develop a really good template file. Now, the template file has changed over the years and adjusted, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but we started off with a really good sense of where we wanted to be. We also had tons of naming conventions. Everything was very specific as far as how things were named, and we were very careful about sticking to those standards as we went, which has some downstream benefits for us. We also started to build a content library, and making sure our naming convention in our content library made sense and was easy to find. I think one of the biggest challenges as an owner compared to, say, a firm is that when a firm is building a building, they're going to live with that building for, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and they're going to live with that library for that amount of time, but after that, they can kind of wipe the slate clean and start over again. Whatever we do, we have to live with for the next 30 or 40 years, unless there's something else that comes along that's beyond Revit, and hopefully I'm not working here anymore because I don't want to make that transition again. So, so we had to think about naming conventions and those types of things, but we also had to think about what we're going to model and how we're going to model it. Are we going to be really, really specific? Are we going to have the exact piece of casework with the exact materiality on it? Are we going to have the exact brand of chair? Or are we going to think about being a little bit more representational with our families? And for us, it just made a whole lot more sense to be more representational. This is a planning tool. And to be quite honest, even if it was an operations tool, knowing the exact brand of casework or chair isn't terribly helpful. It can be in some contexts, but this probably isn't the right place to put some of that information. So we focused on making sure that it was dimensionally correct, and it looked close to what it actually was, that there really are two sinks and they're the same size that there is indicated in the model, but trying to keep the rest of it relatively generic. We also tried to keep our families as parametric as possible so that we can stretch and move them around without having to have several different families of the same thing, and trying to keep that family library limited. Right now, after doing this for 9 years, our family libraries, we have about 760 families. It actually was over 1,000 at one point, but we did a kind of a cleanup and simplification of some of our families over time. But this family library also has to look good two-dimensionally too, because even though we would love everyone to work three-dimensionally, a lot of our systems just view our floor plans two-dimensionally. So we really spend a lot of time making sure the 2D representation of things looks really clean. And if you've ever looked in Revit and just taken a regular old family and then looked at it two-dimensionally, sometimes it just looks like like a mess of lines, and you can't tell what you're looking at. Or even something like a bunk bed in our dorms. How do you describe a bunk bed from on top? And so our 2D representation has a little 2 on top of it, so we know that there are 2 beds there. So we want to think about all these kind of downstream issues as an owner and how we're going to actually use the data. Now, I mentioned we had this owner's model that was kind of our base model, as we call it. But we also, along the way, realized there's a couple different types of buildings that might require a little bit more information, like a residence hall or a parking garage. And so we say, hey, we have these model development levels for those that say, hey, to do all the stuff we say in the base model, plus add a little bit more. And then we also have an additional data model. This is base model plus a bunch more stuff, and it's actually what we say we're going to maintain for buildings that come through the design and construction process. So they come in with a lot more data, and we're going to maintain a lot more of that data going forward since we didn't have to build it. But one thing that we are always very careful about is that once we set kind of what we're going to build in these models, we absolutely stick to it. We do not adjust it. We don't say, well, it would be easy enough to pick up this other piece of information while we're out there. But if we did that all the time, if we just have this massive scope creep and we'd never get the project done. So we've had to be very careful at saying, these are the only things we're going to model in our models today. And we'll come back when we get done with this and consider adding more information to our models. But for sanity's sake, we have to stick to what we agreed to and try to get through the project. As part of that initial process of developing how we're going to go about the project, we also had to develop pretty robust processes, and it kind of breaks down like this. For each building, there's a gather, a build, and a check process. Now, since we use students primarily for our process, the first thing we do when we bring in students at the beginning of the summer is give them a week-long training. We don't assume they know Revit. Some of them have a little bit of experience with it. And we teach them Revit along with teaching our process kind of at the same time. So we only teach them in Revit what they need to know to actually use our process to build buildings. And there's definitely more training than what just happens in that first week. Over the next 6 weeks, there's a cadence of training that occurs, but at maybe an hour or 2 a week going forward. But the first thing students do, or modelers do, is they collect any information that they have about the building. They're going to collect the existing AutoCADs. They're going to collect any record documentation we happen to have. And then they're going to do a field verification process. And to make sure that what we have in AutoCAD today is actually up to date, plus collect a lot more information that we need because we're dealing with 3 dimensions. We're dealing with additional information that we weren't even putting in the AutoCADs originally. Then they're going to build the model, which is obviously the most time-intensive part of it. And then they're going to go through an audit process, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But then we have a combination of some automated audit processes and then some visual audit processes. Students are going to audit their own models first. When they feel like it's clean enough, they're going to pass it off to our BIM coordinator, who's then going to do another check. And that process is going to continue until our BIM coordinator feels that the model is clean and good and ready to go out to the world. So we started off by developing a field verification process. And one of the things that you might think, well, field verification, you just go out there, take some measurements, you're fine. But we've been trying to be very careful about how do we make that process as efficient as possible, not waste time taking more measurements than we have to, and really refining that process over the years. So we've refined that process significantly into exactly how you should go about taking a certain percentage of measurements to make sure that AutoCAD is correct, not every single one. How do you know if an area is a little bit off, and what do you do when you get to that point? Again, a lot of these students have never experienced going out and trying to do these types of field verifications. We use 360 cameras now for all of our photo collection, which has been a game changer for us. It's really easy to go into a room, take a single photo. We've got everything we need to model out that room later. And so we kind of walk through that process with them to make that as efficient as possible. We don't want to spend any more time than we have to. And then we just have an entire process around how we do our modeling and just all the pieces, parts about it. Now this process doesn't tell them how to use Revit. We've already trained them on that. But it does walk them through, this is what you need to do first, this is what you need to do second. And this is different from how an AE is going to build a model. It's just a different process. We're going to start with the core and shell first, very specifically, very carefully, and making sure we get those measurements just right, and then we're going to start building out from there, which may not be that different from how an AE does it, but we have certain ways that we're building the model, things we don't care about, like we don't build foundations because we just don't care about them. They're not going to change. So there's just things that we do and don't do that might be a little different, and we've kind of walked through that step by step on how to do it, and then how to use the AutoCAD as a way to start from if that AutoCAD was trustworthy. One little thing I'll just mention to give you an example of things that we've struggled with is just how to appropriately set the survey point, the project point. For those of you who have experience in Revit, you know this is a kind of a tricky area of Revit to understand. It took us quite a bit of time to wrap our head around how Revit handles these different types of points. And it has a lot of downstream issues for us. If you want to connect multiple Revit models together, use it in 360 or use it in Navisworks, or we actually take our models and downstream them down into an Esri GIS environment. Where do you put those survey points correctly so that all of those different things work correctly? We had to really struggle through that with our consultants to make sure we understood exactly how to do that the best way possible. So that's kind of the build process. Obviously, didn't really go through extreme detail there, but then we move into the audit process, which is how do we keep these models consistent and clean no matter who's building them and no matter what their experience level is. How do we ensure that? And when we were starting the Med Center, we just had a kind of a manual audit process where our BIM coordinator would just look through the model and she had a checklist and she would, try to figure out if was it done correctly. But she was just visually checking a Revit model. And this process took upwards of 2 to 3 days for an average sized model. And frankly, the results were not great. There's just a lot of things you can't check visibly in Revit if you want to stay sane and not quit really her job, which at times I was very concerned that was going to happen. So when we began doing the rest of campus, we said this isn't sustainable. It's also not sustainable because she was getting way behind where the students were at. She couldn't keep up with the number of students we have, and we knew we wanted to ramp up the number of students so we could get more done. And so we ended up using a tool called Celebri, which is an IFC-based model checker. Allowed us to check a whole lot of other things that we couldn't before, like wall joins and lots of other naming conventions and spelling errors, things that are just hard to check visually. So we added that in, and that really reduced that 2 to 3 days for an audit to down to about 1 day on average for most buildings. She still had a visual audit that she had to complete because it didn't check everything, and since it was IFC based, it didn't check things that were Revit specific. But this really, really helped us to be able to keep up with the churn and have much higher quality models coming out of it. In fact, we were so happy with kind of the quality we're getting is that we went back and ran that same check, those Celebri model checks on all of our Med Center models and got those things cleaned up along the way too. And then in 2016, we actually added Autodesk's Revit Model Checker, which is a free plugin, and that allowed us to automate a whole other set of things that Celebri couldn't do. So now we've been able to reduce our model check time, the audit time for our full-time staff down to about half a day. So again, the quality is so much higher than what we started with when it was taking her multiple days and pushing her sanity. So. The nice part about these automated checks too is that students get to do a lot of that work before it even goes to our BIM coordinators. They're doing a lot of their own checking before it gets turned over, and that also allows us to free up time for full-time staff and be able to handle more students at a time doing more conversions. Along the way, we developed some other processes like how do you link an adjacent building to an existing building? How do you combine multiple buildings together if you want to have maybe a little bit of a site plan? And even how do you do renderings? And we want to develop renderings of every building just so we have a little bit of eye candy to pass around to show the kind of work we're doing. And so how do you do that best? And what is the way you go about that? But one thing we did not start off with and we developed over time is this idea of developing plugins that would specifically help our process. And over the years, we've created all of these plugins for ourselves that sped up the process or improved quality. One example is that every space has what we call a space ID, and it's very specific to the way we do it. It's building, floor, room, and then potentially a cube or a subspace number. And this is all being hand entered by the students. This process alone would take a student about a day when they're finished with the building. Complete waste of time. They'd have to enter the room number and then enter the space ID by hand, and there were a lot of errors with that. Now with the tool, they just enter the room number. It extracts the building number and the floor number from other locations. It takes about 5 seconds. And also, we also have subrooms like cubes or lab benches or other types of places where we've divided a room up into smaller sections. And this tool does something similar to that, where it helps load in things to the right places. Also deals with certain things we do with our tags as it applies to those subspaces. Another one is just be able to speed up the process of creating sheets. So we create one sheet the way we want it to look. We hit the sheet creator, and it develops all the rest of the floors. So they're all consistent, they look the same, but it also saves us a lot of time in creating those individually. Once you get into the process of maintaining these models, the students have already created their work. We've said it's good. We've passed it on to onto the network. It's out in the world, and and things are changing in that model. Every time we change it, though, we have to export all these different files out, from DWFs, DWGs, PDFs, IFCs. These are all files that we make generally accessible to folks. And instead of having to go in and check each one of those things and export them individually, and especially since we actually use different view templates for each one of those different file types, we developed a closeout automation where you can just hit a button, exports everything you need, puts it in the right locations on our network, and again, simplifies our life. I think one of the big benefits we've seen with a tool like Revit is just the ability to do this type of thing. I like to say that Revit is a database with a drawing component, and it acts a lot like that. So we can really look at how to automate our processes and simplify some of our work because Revit is this kind of database tool. And the last tool we built for this process was what we call our file archiver updater tool. And if you have any experience having to deal with that change every year that Revit makes to their file format, this is a real challenge for us because we have so many models. We actually have well over 400 models total if you consider all the buildings that we've brought in from the design and construction process. And we just simply can't update those individually. It would just take, it would take us, right now we think about a month of man hours to actually just sit there and upgrade every single file individually. Revit has a bulk updater tool, updater tool. It does not work very well either for our purposes. And so this tool is very powerful for us, and it ignores a lot of warnings. It deals with all sorts of other things. It puts files where they belong in the network. It makes it back up those files before it upgrades them. And now we get this process down to about 3 days in the evening, meaning it takes about an hour's worth of actual staff time. So these types of tools have been really critical for us to actually survive having this many of these models. Revit has a lot of benefits to us, and we actually find that in general, and I'll mention this again in a moment, but that it takes less time for us to manage our models when it comes to changing things, when things change. But you really have to think about how to manage the entire environment because you're dealing with kind of a different beast. And so we've been able to develop some tools that help us to manage some of the things that are a little more challenging with Revit and do it in an elegant way. An additional tool that we've been working on over the last year is what we're calling internally the BIM portal. It's a tool called Clarity. It's from Imagineit. And we're implementing this tool just to help us manage the number of files that we have because we simply have too many files to manage easily, just kind of in a file structure. We want to be able to share files more effectively across campus. We've got a lot of different IT organizations on campus that don't talk to each other. So we have lots of folks out there developing their own models, say equipment models or furniture models or even their own MEP models. And we want to be able to connect all these things together into our architectural models we've been building. We want to do a lot of data extraction, lots of this rich data in Revit. We get asked the question once in a while, hey, can you tell me how many toilets are on main campus, which is like 400 buildings, or how many sinks you have, or how many square feet of something you have. And I can do that by building relatively easily, but I can't scale that up. And so the nice part about Clarity is it takes all of the data of your Revit models, and then you have now a database of all this information. We're starting to build queries around the types of questions that people are asking. And then it just allows us to further automate our processes. So doing even more automation than we're doing today and more no-touch automation. So just letting the system take care of things and even do things that we're not doing today. This is an example just to kind of having all the files all together in one place on a web browser. This is an example of some of the data that it can extract and how it looks. And this is very early. We actually are going to be looking at how we make this a little more user-friendly to our customers. And also things that we can't do today, like aggregate a lot of metrics about our models, maybe size of models and number of families. In this case, the last one is number of medium warnings in this particular Revit model. They may not matter, but we know that we have an issue, particularly in this model, and there's a lot of medium level warnings. And having this type of information for us, where we're not having to open up every individual model, we can actually have a dashboard that tells us where we need to focus our energy on, or a model is getting out of control or something bad has happened, we can catch those things a lot easier, a lot earlier, and clean up those things before they become problems. So we have a lot of hope that over time we're going to continue to mature our use of this tool, and it's going to become really, really valuable to us in how we actually manage our environment. So that's kind of what we've done and how we did it in brief, but what are some of the outcomes? How have we found this to be valuable for us at Ohio State? The first thing is just improved accuracy. We had to go out and field verify all of our buildings, and not one of our AutoCADs is perfect. They all had something that we didn't know about. And especially at a place like Ohio State, there's a lot of little construction projects that happen that somebody didn't tell anybody about. They just did it on their own, and we got a wall that's different, or a door that's different. And so we have these wonderful field verified plans. We even have things like, our exterior walls and our elevator shafts actually stack. And I will be honest that the majority of the time in our AutoCAD plans, that wasn't the case, because we needed to make something work somewhere, and so we moved things around and we didn't double check that they still stacked correctly. So it was little things like that that really improved our overall accuracy of our models. We have a lot more data in our models now. We have all sorts of exterior data. We have GIS data. We have heights and volumes. We have the correct window placement vertically. So there's all this additional data that we're collecting and then building into our models that we just did not have in a 2D world. As I mentioned, we feel like this is actually, it's quicker for us. If a wall changes, it's faster to make that change in Revit than it was in AutoCAD. Revit knows it's a wall. It all moves together. It understands what's happening. There's a lot more intelligence to it. And then we can also, as I mentioned, we can manage all this data and all these models and these drawings in a more systematized way, in a more automated way. And that's been a big benefit to us. Our models are more intelligent now. And AutoCAD, as great as it is, it's just lines on an electronic piece of paper. It doesn't have any inherent intelligence. And when you move to a Revit-based and a BIM-based workflow for this type of thing, you have spaces that understand their space and a wall that understands it's a wall. You can do additional things with that information. You have a lot more information about your facilities at that point, and with really no additional cost to actually, once you've built that wall, you've got that information. And the ability then to connect to other systems. That this is the beginning of an ecosystem where we look at bringing all sorts of data sets and live data systems into an intelligent place. And because it understands that this thing is a thing, this room is a real thing, and this asset is a thing, we can connect to it. The future is that we're going to have much more connected systems that are viewable in, say, a 3D platform that allows our first line and our frontline techs to really be able to operate and manage our facilities in a more intelligent manner. This also serves as the future foundation, and we're only building architectural models. So if you're thinking, well, I can't use it in operations much, and you're generally accurate. There's not a huge value right now until we start adding more assets from an operations standpoint. But as projects occur, and we get maybe partial Revit models, maybe a small MEP project was completed, but it was done in Revit, we then can start bringing these things into our base architectural model. So it starts as that foundation that we can use to build on. And then in the design and construction process too, they're able to start with something three-dimensional that is going to help them to get up to speed about how that building is laid out as they do renovations. And some of the more visual things that we've been able to do is just around planning. And traditionally, and even, it still happens today, we would provide something like this to a senior leader. And this is an actual example of a senior leader that came on board the Med Center. We provided about 4 or 5 of these layouts in 2D. And for those of you who deal with other people, you understand, you can look at 2D drawings and understand what they look like, but most of the folks that you give a 2D drawing cannot. But they will look at you and they will act like they know what they're looking at. And then they'll be super unhappy when it's built and they're like, that is not what I thought this was supposed to be. So, looking at a 2D is like reading a book. There's a lot of imagination involved. But when you look at a 3D rendering, it's more about looking at a movie. You just don't even have to turn your brain on when you go to a movie. You can just let it happen. So we were able to provide something like this to the senior leader. And again, this is very simple stuff. Once you have your model built, throwing some furniture in a room and making a quick rendering of it is very simple. As an owner, you can do this without a whole lot of training once you have the stuff built. But to be able to provide that new senior leader then with these types of images, and the senior leader came in and said the office looked exactly like I thought it was going to. And we were anecdotally around 50% of the time a senior leader would come in and say, this is not what I wanted, this is not working for me, and I want to change it. So there's cost there and inconvenience. with this type of idea, you're taking away that imagination. You're helping the organization make better decisions, and you're helping them make it more quickly because they're able to look at something that makes sense to them. Or this example where we have this kind of weird concrete tower structure we're trying to put some systems furniture in. And the initial version of this that was given to the customer had regular, like 5 or 6 foot height walls. And I have no idea why they thought that was a good idea with windows right there, but the point is that when they showed it to the customer immediately said, why are we covering up these windows? Why would we do that? Go back to the office, and within 30 minutes, you've fixed that issue. You've have better height walls for that. You've been able to put in some clear pane in the front of those other cubes there. And this didn't cost anything. But if we would have put it into place like it was, we would have had either an unhappy customer who was just going to live with it, or we're going to spend a lot of money changing that. So something that would not have been caught in 2D world unless somebody was really thinking about it. But instantly, we can see these types of things. Again, all done internally. We didn't involve anybody outside. This is something we can do in-house because we have those tools available to us and we have those models built. Or thinking about just a fit and finishes update and being able to pull the exact floor color and paint color from the manufacturer and put it in a model. Even in this case, the exact marketing materials that the marketing team wanted to put up on the wall, allowing senior leaders to see what the outcome is going to be if they spent some money on this project. We use it for donor recognition quite a bit, actually, in helping donors see what their name is going to look like on a wall, on the outside of a building or in a conference room, or if a new building is being built, what their conference room is going to look like, or that lobby is going to look like before it's done with their name on it. And we found that to be very valuable in connecting with donors in that way. Then you start getting into, we have a good amount, now that we have so much of our university in Revit, we can start doing higher level things like this is our union and we want to put a stage in front of it. And so we're able to take that model that we have, this great model we have, the union, and put it in context, along with great GIS data that we have, and start helping. And we do this all with students, by the way. We have a student design studio that's all student-led, that's used architecture students and interior design students. Again, before we even have to go out to an outside firm to start working on this, we can play with ideas internally because we have this Revit environment that allows us to do this stuff at very, very low cost now. Or this building, which looks much worse in real life, does not have that glass part in the front there. We're looking at potentially putting a road in front there that doesn't exist today. And if we do that, should we make some changes to the building? Again, allowing our student-led design studio to build out these types of things because we have the skill and we have the models in-house. Or our stadium, which took a really long time to build and was extremely difficult. It's very big, but we're very proud of the fact that we built this. It took about 2 students and a staff member to get that one done. Or making a barn look good, right? So we have a lot of agriculture. So there's a barn in Revit. I mean, doesn't have a huge amount of value, but hey, it looks good, right? They made the wood look nice. Or a cow barn, and the student wanted to make sure that we all knew what this barn was looking for. So in their rendering, they decided to put a couple barns in there. Now they did not put it's really not in the middle of a desert. It's just, there really is no they just didn't put a background there. I wish they would at least put some grass, but but this allows us, again, we have the ability then to really be able to explain and reduce that time it takes for people to make decisions about future design work. And we're able to do that internally. We've been able to use students quite a bit in allowing them to refine their skills, but also, frankly, get really, really cheap labor. And it allows us to play around with ideas without having to spend a lot of money on these ideas. So that's really what I want to share with you regarding our BIM for existing buildings and kind of how we've been transitioning those buildings over time. I want to talk just a little bit about then what that led into, which was our BIM for design and construction. And along the way, we started to realize that the industry was beginning to use BIM in a lot of our larger projects. They started to say, hey, do you want these Revit files at the end of the project? We're going to be doing these types of use cases with BIM throughout the project. Want to share those with you. But as an organization, we weren't really well versed in that. And we said, that's interesting. And we're starting to see some real value in some of our projects regarding timelines and the reduction in change orders and RFIs because folks were using these BIM tools. And we said, maybe we should think about, as an owner, developing a project delivery standard that would require our projects to use BIM-centric workflows and talk about what kind of turnover documentations we'd get. And so a general project delivery standard typically answers 2 questions. How are you going to execute that project? what are the turnover documents going to be at the end of the project? What are the deliverables? At OSU, we've really focused on that second question. We're not telling teams how to run a project. We do tell them, here are the use cases that I want you to follow. Here are the things that you have to do, but you're going to tell us how you're going to do them. You're going to tell us how often you're going to meet. You're going to tell us how you're going to exchange files. You're going to tell us how you're going to use this for design intent or clash detection or prevention. We really focus on this idea of we want really good turnover documents at the end of the project. We want to be able to use this as an owner afterwards in a way that makes sense to us. Now, if you are interested in reading more about our standards, and almost everything I'll share about the project delivery standard is available at fod.osu.edu/resources. There's a BIM section in there, and there's a lot of resources underneath there. All of it's public from our BIM project delivery standard, which is only around 25 pages long, and about 4 of that is a glossary. It's not a very long standard. We've tried to keep it simple so that people find it approachable and easy to actually meet our expectations. We did not want to develop a standard that was so cumbersome and challenging that it took our AECs forever just to understand what was in the standard. The BIM execution plan is up there if you want to see that. I'll talk about in a section. All the tools that we use, that we give to our teams are all up there. So everything that we have around how we manage our projects is available on that website. One of the first deliverables that they turn over to us is a BIM execution plan. Most of the teams are already doing one themselves, but we want it in our format. And this is really, again, a way for them to communicate to us how they're going to run a project. How are you going to meet our goals? Who are the people? Who are the main people that we need to be talking to? Who are the BIM managers on these different, for the different teams? How are you going to collaborate? How are you going to transmit documents? And also some things are just to validate that they understand what we're asking for. Things like, how are you entering the coordinates into your model, and what are the coordinates? And how are you naming your files, and what are the levels, what are your level names, and what are the elevations of those levels? Because we have some specific details about how they need to do that in the model. And so we review this shortly after design, all the design partners on board, and we review it again when all the construction team members are on board, because there's pieces that they have to update at that point then. One of the pieces that's part of this is the LOD matrix of BIM deliverables, and this is a gigantic spreadsheet that says, here's the LOD of everything we care about that we want you to model. It has to be graphically represented in the model. But also in the end, you see this asset tag and COBie required column, and that says, for these assets, we want to make sure that you provide to us actual data. And I'll talk a little more about that process in a moment, but we want asset data about those things. We're going to load those into our work order systems and our asset management system. And so they know from the very beginning of the project what their expectations are going to be around how we want the model built, what we want to be turned over to us, and what kind of data they're expected to turn over at the end of a project too. So the turnover documentation comes in a couple flavors. One is we want a conformed design intent model. And really, sometimes when I say that term, people are not quite sure what I mean by that. And all I mean is take your design intent models that the AE developed and just keep them conformed throughout the project, throughout construction. So as changes occur in the field, they need to be changed in the design intent model. What it does not mean is that we want you to add more data to the model or take individual elements and raise their LOD. This is exactly the design intent model the AE developed, and we're just going to ask you to continue to conform it throughout the project so at the end we have something that works for us. We don't take as-built, we don't take the construction models. They are too heavy for us, too detailed, and so we pretty much stick with those record sets from the AEs. But at 75% construction or thereabouts, depending on the size of the project, we're going to ask you to turn over the architectural and the structural models as they are at that point. There's probably very little that's going to happen at that point in the building from a change perspective. We then take those and bring those into our environment and have them match up from a standardization perspective to the models that we've been building over time for our existing facilities. And those then become our owner's models. And we do this because we have lots of systems downstream that need our data, from E911, and how we handle Skype and locations for Skype, to our work order locations, to asset locations. And all these systems are pulling from our systems, so we have to have those models cleaned up. We have to have all that data put into our space information system so that all these systems that are feeding from that have access to it. And then about 90 days after the project is complete, we're going to ask for a full set of those conformed models, which is essentially the record set. And then we also ask for COBie and asset information. I'll talk through that a little bit more here in a moment. Now, we don't make a lot of requirements for them around how they build that model. We have a process of cleaning it up anyway afterwards, but we do have some specifics around how they put rooms in the model, hosting elements to approved floor levels instead of having things hosted to all sorts of different levels. We don't allow prototypes or typicals to be used at all. Every last thing has to be modeled. And we want them to use clear descriptive family names because that has an effect on how those assets are described when we start looking at COBie and the asset piece of it. So from a COBie perspective, anybody familiar with COBie here? Okay. If you've looked, for those of you who've looked at a COBie spreadsheet, you know it's just almost incomprehensible. It's just this gigantic spreadsheet with all these connections between the different tabs, very hard for people to use. But we found that it's the easiest way for us to get all the data we want out of the AE models. So we actually use Autodesk's COBie toolkit with a slightly modified XML file, which is kind of like the settings of that, and we have a long set of instructions. Again, you can actually find this all on the website, to have them export all their data out into this COBie spreadsheet that matches up with that LOD matrix. They have to kind of go through there and make sure they're only exporting the things that we care about. And then they're going to send that over to us, and we're going to run a macro on that that's going to make it really simple, just a one-tab, simple asset worksheet. And we're going to take that thing and pass it off to the contractor, and the contractor is then going to fill in things like serial number, manufacturer, install date, those types of things that only they're going to know. But that COBie spreadsheet is delivered to us at the end of 3D coordination, and then depending on the project, the rest of the information is turned over at occupancy or a couple, 30 days afterwards. And then those spreadsheets then are loaded into our various work order management systems across campus. So that's how we've done it today. I'm not going to tell you it's clean or perfect. We still have issues with COBie. I'm not a big believer that COBie is the future for us. I think it still has too many challenges for us to make this work well. But right now it's the best we have, and at some point we might make a change to how we actually handle this. But as I said, we have a lot of processes that we've built for CAD to BIM, but we've got processes for what we call BIM to BIM. So we get these models in that are totally different from each other, and we have a process for going through and cleaning up those models, bringing it into our template, standardizing names, so that at the end of the day, whether we built the model ourselves or the model comes from the outside, we have consistent models that we can use then to manage our facilities going forward. And that all the things that we've done around automation will work no matter where the model came from. And some of the tools that we have for that, we have a view and sheet deleter. Gets rid of all those, the many views and sheets that you're going to find in a model that was used for design. And it just leaves behind the views that actually have geometry associated with them, and gets rid of all of our sheets, allows us to really quickly clean up our models, then we can kind of build our stuff from there. We have imported line and pattern deleter, again, just cleaning up the model really quickly so we don't have to do it ourselves. Now over time, we developed our first project delivery standard in 2015, and spent about a little over a year with consultants really developing that, doing a deep dive into our organization and trying to understand what would work for us, what made sense, and what we really cared about. But even with that, we made a lot of changes over the years. One thing we heard from a lot of our project partners was that we had our LOD matrix at uniform at level 3, which is pretty high level. They said, this is not detailed enough for us. We need much more detailed. So we went down to level 4, which made that spreadsheet very large, but that's what they wanted. So even at that point, there's still a lot of times we have to add a note saying, okay, you don't need to give us asset information for all of these things, just for these couple things within that group. We removed the use of LOD 500, and if you're familiar with LOD, 500 is basically either sometimes called an owner's LOD or a field verified LOD. Regardless, it was confusing, and it didn't really give us anything that was helpful. It just made people ask questions about what we wanted. So we got rid of that one. We removed the construction team turnover documents. For some reason, our first version, we were asking for that. Well, we don't even use them, so we got rid of that. Made a lot of changes to that COBie and asset, that the whole process I showed you didn't show up till version 3. And then we also, along the same time, released what we call our BIM PDS tools, which are not only the COBie toolkit, but also the Revit model checker, which is another tool from Autodesk. We've been able to write a custom set of rules for that help teams run that rule set to make sure that they're following some of our guidelines before they start turning over projects to us. Now, our BIM project delivery standard only is required for projects over $4 million. But over time, we found that lots of projects under that threshold wanted to start using it. Either they were using it and just wanted to meet our standards, or we had PMs internally who were saying, we really like the outcomes of using BIM in these projects, and I've got a smaller project, and I want to require it on my project. And so we actually made some changes to the way our RFP and our RFIs work, and then also in our standards, that if you have a project under $4 million, there's some ways to kind of almost have like a light version of our standard for those projects. And that has been received quite well. I think in the future we'll eventually require the BIM project delivery standard to be used in all projects, but I think there's always going to be kind of a step down when you get into smaller projects. So lastly, as far as going over how we use BIM is operations, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this. We're still very new to how we want to get there. This is really our future state. This is where we want to go. We want to have this ecosystem of models that are intelligent and connected. We want to build some sort of BIM middleware technology at the bottom. There's a number of solutions that are available out there in the market today that I would say are not quite where we want them to be, but we eventually want to start bringing in, in this intelligent system, information about work order history and asset information and O&M information and automation information that's coming from our different sensors and stuff, and bring this all into one place so that when somebody is out in the field, they have access to all the information they might need to actually best manage their facilities. And to be honest, I would say that this is where we're going to see the biggest benefit. If we can pull it off, if we can get there, if we can get the right technology solutions there, the value to our organization is going to be best here, where we're going to see some real high-end dollar value when we're able to more effectively manage our facilities. And so this is kind of where we're heading over the next couple of years. So I just want to share with you, kind of to wrap up, some of the lessons that we've learned as a single owner with a lot of buildings that we have to maintain for a very long time. And the first is having proper planning and focus. You really want to make sure that as you go into this type of effort, that you really think through what do you want, what needs to be modeled, what has the highest ROI, but what you can also maintain. And so having that focus to say, I don't want everything, I want things that are most valuable to me. And not spending forever in the planning process, right? But getting through that process and moving forward. Having effective training, if you're whether you're using staff or using students to do something like this, making sure that you're training those folks effectively so they can do the best possible job. And then also training all your end users. So we want all our customers to begin using Revit in their worlds too. And so every year we offer several university-wide trainings, hands-on trainings, where we bring in a trainer and they teach Revit basics, they teach Revit for conceptual design, they teach even AutoCAD basics. We want to make sure our users are using our data the most effectively so that we can operate our facilities the best. We want to continually improve, so we've changed our process over time. In fact, when we moved over to main campus, we realized there's a lot of problems with the way that we had set up our template and a lot of some small process challenges that we had made. We actually had to go back and upgrade all those models, making some changes to them so that they would match the rest of our models. Now, we're never going to do it again. At this point, how our models are set up or how they're set up, but we continue to refine our processes, make them more efficient, make them more accurate, make them work better. We continue to refine our templates and our families so that what we have today is better than we've ever had it. It's really important to standardize things. I've definitely heard of owners who've gone out and said, I just started building Revit models and they're all kind of different. And that's fine if you have 2 or 3 buildings and you're not planning to do a lot of automation around that. But once you start hitting 10, 20, 30 buildings, this becomes a really challenging thing to manage. And so we encourage people to make sure they standardize their processes and their templates and their families and their naming conventions. All these things are going to make it easier to manage your models going forward. And it just takes that time up front to think through how you want to do that. And then as much as possible, there's all these great tools that I've talked about, automating as much as you can, whether it be from the model checking side that we've done in through a lot of the plugins that we've written. We use the tool called Unify to help manage our families, which simplifies that process. And then moving on to Clarity to help us manage our models more effectively. Once you have things standardized, the ability to automate is a lot simpler. And lastly is this idea of partnering and collaborating. Initially, we made sure to talk with our internal customers and stakeholders to ensure that we knew what they wanted from these models. And that was important. We didn't want to just hide behind our cube walls and come up with something that we thought worked well. And that was true also when we developed our BIM project delivery standard, which was a year-long effort of literally deep diving into our organization. But also externally, we've had very, very productive long-term relationships with our consultants that have come in and filled all those knowledge gaps in that we don't have ourselves. And this is really what has allowed us to be very successful over the years, having those partners that have really been able to work with us. And for some of them, learn along with us because they didn't fully understand how some of the things that we were dealing with, some of the challenges owners had. But they're able to bring their knowledge to bear to help us be successful. Now, we've recently actually packaged up everything that we've learned, all of our processes, all of our plugins, everything that we have, all of our family library. And if you're interested in more in that, if that's something that you actually want to think about someday, you can go to that website or just talk to anybody from Imagine It, actually. But it's a way just to learn from our mistakes and not do the same stuff we did, and actually have the benefit of those of all that learning we've done in the kind of a continual improvement that we've applied to it. We still have ongoing challenges, obviously. Things that we're still trying to learn is how do we manage these models effectively going in the future? How do we upgrade even more models every year than we have in the past? We feel like we have things in place to help that, but we keep learning. How do we maintain the MEP models? We're getting these great MEP models from projects, but I don't have any staff that can manage. I don't have enough staff. As these become more important to the organization, what do we do? How do we handle that? A couple different ways to think about that. How do we better collaborate across the university as other people are using Revit in their workflows and as we're sharing data with each other in models? As I mentioned, we're building out a lot more in clarity. And then how do we use all this data we're getting from these projects and from our models better in operations? And then also, how do we visualize our entire campus three-dimensionally? And we have a very active GIS group within my team too that's looking at how do we do that but using the same level of detail that we have in these Revit models. Technology's not quite there yet, but we're getting there, so that we can think about planning kind of a more macro level, but in a way that looks very accurate and helps people understand the campus more effectively. So, we're still learning, we're still trying to figure out things. After almost 10 years of going through this process, it's been quite the journey for us, but we found a lot of benefits to it, a lot of value to it, and frankly, it's been a lot of fun too to try to deal with some of these challenges that we've come across and come on the other side and be able to manage this much space in a 3D format. So that's what I have for you today, and probably have maybe like 5 or 10 minutes for some questions.